This lady I have on my left-hand side is an assistant professor at the Department of Chemistry, Materials and Chemical Engineering Giulio Natta of Politecnico di Milano, Italy. Her research relates to odor assessment, focusing on odor sampling, development of e-nosis, dispersion modeling, and characterization of odor emissions from industrial activities. She has authored more than 100 papers in international journals and conferences. So thank you, Laura, for being keynote speakers and for your speech that is supposed to be about the odor management in Europe, right?
Yes, thank you very much, Carlos, for the invitation and for the introduction. Just a correction, luckily I'm associate professor now, not assistant professor anymore. This is not very important. I don't want to lose much time by introducing myself. But I just wanted to say that I realized that I've been working in the field of environmental odor monitoring for almost 20 years now. In those almost 20 years of activity, it's the first time for me that I'm invited to give a keynote lecture at a conference. So I'm very happy that this first keynote lecture for me happens here at the IWA conference in Bilbao. I feel very honored, also a little nervous, I must say, because indeed trying to summarize and speak about the current status of odor pollution in Europe is, in 10 minutes, is quite a big task. Indeed, the history of odor pollution in Europe is a long history now. The awareness about odor pollution in Europe has arose already several years ago, especially in Germany, I would say. That's where everything started. And the first guideline, which described a method specifically for odor measurement, which was dynamic olfactometry, dates now back to the 1980s, 1986 to be precise. So quite a long time ago. And since then, big efforts have been made for the development and the standardization of specific methods for odor measurement. In Europe, the standardization body is the CEN, the European Committee for Standardization, and through the CEN, we now have different European standards. In 2003, the EN 13725 on dynamic olfactometry was issued, which you all know. I know that yesterday you had a presentation by Ton van Areveld explaining that this standard has recently undergone a revision process. More recently, in 2016, there has been the publication of the EN 1618441, moving from the sources to the field. It's a European standard standardizing field inspections. And then there is the chapter of the draft standards on IOMS, instrumental odor monitoring systems, which include e-noses, which has not come to an end yet, but which hopefully will come to an end very soon. What about the situation of regulations in Europe? Also about regulations, you had a presentation yesterday, so you already know that in the world things are very different, but also across Europe there are differences. There are countries which have national regulations, some other countries in which regulations are on a local, regional level, and many other countries in which there is nothing at all. However, for those countries for which there is some sort of local or national regulation, one common approach can be somehow identified. And the most common regulatory approach that is adopted in European countries is the one based on, first, the quantification of odor emissions by dynamic olfactometry to measure odor concentration and then evaluate odor emission rates, and then the use of this data as input data for dispersion models, for odor dispersion models, to evaluate impacts on the affected communities. However, despite being very widespread, this approach, it has some limitations. But first of all, it requires the sources to be quantified. So in such cases in which the sources are not identified, this is not applicable. But then one big issue is still the characterization of odor emissions from complex sources. This is still, for many types of complex sources, I would say an open issue. And also there is another limitation related to the fact that dynamic olfactometry is relatively expensive, let's say, but discontinuous. So by this type of olfactometric measurement, it is not possible to obtain real-time data or distributed, spatially distributed for extended sources, which makes that often odor dispersion models are run based on time-averaged values, which not necessarily are capable of accounting for the variability of emissions. These, in some cases, especially in complex cases, might result in a scarce correlation between model predictions and effective odor impact. So what can be done in order to improve the representation of odor impacts that can be obtained? Is it possible to develop more effective regulatory approaches capable of accounting for citizens' exposure? Well, first of all, let's try to make some consideration. These are my personal views of what could be done, what is being done in order to improve the correlation between model predictions and the evaluation of other impacts. On one hand, it is possible, as first thing, to improve or to develop new direct methods for source characterization. This requires an in-depth study of the mechanisms that regulate emissions from complex sources, such as, for instance, area sources, and the development of new models capable of accounting for the influence of different variables. You've had a presentation yesterday by a collaborator of us, one of our PhD students. This is just an example to say the work that can be done in order to try to develop new models that try to account, for instance, for the influence of temperature on the emissions from liquid area sources. A second thing that could be done in the future could be the development of indirect methods for the estimation of complex odor emissions. Indirect methods, or often called micrometeorological methods, are capable to combine local micrometeorological conditions and downwind concentration measurements in order to estimate emission fluxes. In truth, these indirect methods are very often mentioned in the scientific literature as an alternative to direct methods, but in practice they are rarely applied. However, they have recently gained, again, some interest because the instrumentation that is required for their implementation has meanwhile become more reliable and also more affordable in terms of cost. And this is something I will talk about in my presentation of this afternoon. Other future developments could include the methods to obtain better time and spatially distributed emission data. And these include, for instance, the use of drones to collect concentration data over extended areas. I know that there is a session this afternoon related to this topic, and I'm very curious to hear about that. But also IOMS go a little bit in this direction because if properly trained, they are able to provide real-time odor concentration data, and so to account for the variability of odor emissions. Also, it is possible to think to integrate or to consider different approaches, like bottom-up approaches like citizen science. In citizen science, citizens record their odor perceptions with apps or with different methods by reporting frequency, intensity, and the type of odor that they perceive in order to provide a more complete picture of the odor issue over the observed territory. You have heard yesterday about the DNOSES project that has been carried out as a Horizon 2020 project, research project in Europe, which just concluded, and which has seen the participation of several partners all over Europe. We were part of the project, and also the setup of different pilot studies in Europe and also outside of Europe. Well, based on the positive experience of the diagnosis, to look a little bit to the very next future, based on the positive experience of the diagnosis project in Spain, a working group has been established for the development of a Spanish standard on mapping odor annoyance by using citizen science, which includes 4 task groups dealing with different specific tasks like participation and transparency, methodology, plausibility verifications, and terms and definitions. So this is something that we will probably see, hopefully very soon. And then, still as future outlook to the very next future, we hope to see the European standard on IOMS. The working group has now interrupted its activity because, well, we exceeded a little bit the times that were allowed, but this doesn't stop us, meaning that the intention is to reconstitute the working group and restart from when we stopped in order to come as soon as possible to the draft of a European standard on this technology. So to conclude, regarding the current status of regulations in Europe, as you have seen, they are not always homogeneous, although a common approach can be somehow identified. And as we said, this approach still entails some limitations. Thus, further research is needed to overcome such limitations and pave the way possibly for a common regulation on odor pollution across Europe. In this context, standardization of methods is a key element towards this ambitious goal. So as you can imagine, the road to go is still long. But I must say that I'm quite happy about that because this means that I will not get bored over the next years. Thank you very much for your attention and again for this invitation.